Welcome to the self-guided training for sellers of Tier 1 and Tier 2 restricted components. Everyone who deals with chemical manufacture, distribution, or sale is part of an exceptional business, one in which a simple transaction could lead to tragedy. Following regulatory requirements and having sufficient awareness to detect suspicious activities help keep our community safe. If you are a component seller or product seller of Tier 1 or Tier 2 restricted components, then this training is for you. This 4-module training is designed to help sellers comply with the regulatory requirements of Canada's explosives regulations for the secure storage and sale of restricted components. During this training, we will 1. Provide a brief overview of the program. 2. Discuss some key definitions. 3. Review the regulatory requirements for the storage and sale of Tier 1 and Tier 2 restricted components. And 4. Cover the obligation for sellers to report incidents regarding restricted components. Module 1. Introduction. The Explosives Regulatory Division manages the Restricted Component Compliance and Education Program, which is part of Natural Resources Canada. This program promotes chemical security through the chemical supply chain, from manufacturers to distributors to retailers. We enforce the Explosives Act and regulations and provide education to everyone involved regarding their responsibilities to keep Canada safe. This is achieved with industry, law enforcement, national and international organizations. Chemical security is everyone's business, and NRCan is taking proactive steps to ensure the safety of our communities. Restricted components are explosives precursor chemicals that are regulated in Canada. These chemicals have many legitimate uses, but can also be used to manufacture homemade explosives. Restricted components are regulated in Canada because of their widespread use in terrorist attacks. Restricted components, which are widely used and readily available, include fertilizers, paint thinners, solid camping fuel tablets, instant cold packs, and nail polish removers. There are 3 categories of restricted components: Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3. How stringent the requirements are depends on what tier a restricted component falls in, with Tier 1 being the most stringent and Tier 3 being the least. Please note, this training will only discuss the regulatory requirements for sellers of Tier 1 and Tier 2 components. Sellers of Tier 3 components are only required to follow reporting obligations, which are discussed in Module 3. Tier 1 restricted components include ammonium nitrate in solid form and calcium ammonium nitrate. Tier 2 restricted components include hydrogen peroxide, potassium nitrate, nitromethane, potassium chlorate, sodium chlorate, potassium perchlorate, nitric acid, sodium nitrate in solid form, sodium nitrate and potassium nitrate mixture, aluminum powder in dry form and with a particle size of less than 200 micrometers, and hexamine. Tier 3 components include acetone, ammonium nitrate contained in a cold pack, and calcium ammonium nitrate contained in a cold pack. Now that you are familiar with explosives precursor chemicals that are regulated as restricted components in Canada, let's look at the definition of different types of sellers: a component seller and a product seller. A component seller is a person who sells a restricted component. A product seller is a person who manufactures a product, other than an explosive, for sale using a restricted component. Only sellers of restricted components or manufacturers using a restricted component to manufacture a product for sale, other than an explosive, are subject to Part 20 of the Explosives Regulations. End users are not regulated. Also, many mixtures are not regulated if their concentrations are below the regulated limits. Note that product sellers using aluminum powder or hexamine to manufacture a product are exempt from Part 20 of the regulations. Module 2. Part 1. Regulatory requirements for Tier 1 and Tier 2 restricted components. This module will explore the regulatory requirements for sellers of Tier 1 and Tier 2 components. The main intent of the regulations is to control the access, the inventory, and the sale of restricted components. Just a reminder that sellers of Tier 1 components have additional requirements that will be discussed in Part 2 of this module. As a seller of Tier 1 or Tier 2 restricted components, you must 1. Enroll with NRCan. 2. Secure your chemicals. 3. Know your inventory. And 4. Control your sales. You must obtain your enrollment before selling or using a restricted component to manufacture a product for sale. Enroll as a component seller or product seller of a Tier 1 or Tier 2 restricted component on our website. Note that product sellers who acquire or manufacture aluminum powder or hexamine to manufacture a product for sale do not need to enroll. There are no fees to enroll, and enrollments are valid for 5 years from the date they are issued. If the information you provide in your application changes, you must update it within 10 days after the date of the change. As a component or product seller, you must secure your restricted components. The components must be locked up when not attended. This could include locking the components in a cabinet on the store floor, keeping them in a restricted area, or keeping them behind the sales counter. Signs that warn against unauthorized access must be posted on the entrance to each location where a component is stored. Access to the components must be limited to the people you authorize to have access. Also, a list of employees who work at each location where a component is stored or sold must be available if it is ever requested. You're responsible for knowing your inventory and keeping track of your stock. You must have a stock management system to account for a restricted component that is under your control. This can be done electronically or on paper. Sellers are also required to conduct weekly inspections of the component and record the results of each inspection, including any loss or tampering, and the cause of any loss that is not attributable to normal operations. The records of these weekly inspections must be kept on file for 2 years. You must also control sales by establishing the identity of the buyer and taking records of sales, which we will now cover in more detail. There are 3 different categories of buyers. 1. A buyer that will use the component to manufacture an explosive. 2. A buyer that intends to sell the component. And 3. A buyer that is either an end user or will use the component for another purpose. Different types of identification are required depending on what the component will be used for. If the buyer intends to use the component to manufacture an explosive, the buyer must provide an explosives license or certificate number. If the buyer intends to resell the component, the buyer must provide proof that they are enrolled with NRCan as a component seller. The buyer can provide a copy of the enrollment letter or the enrollment number that was issued by NRCan. In all other cases, the buyer must establish their identity by providing one of the following: a piece of identification issued by the Government of Canada or a provincial, municipal, or foreign government that bears a photograph of the buyer, a driver's license, for example, or a passport. 2 pieces of identification, each of which sets out the buyer's name, at least one of which is issued by the Government of Canada or a provincial, municipal, or foreign government, and at least one of which sets out the buyer's address. The buyer's provincial pesticide license. Proof of registration with Quebec's Ministère de l'Agriculture, des Pêcheries et de l'Alimentation. The buyer's Ontario Federation of Agriculture number. The buyer's business license or proof of the buyer's corporate registration, or proof of the buyer's registration under the Controlled Goods Regulations. No matter the quantity of restricted component you are selling, you must always verify the identity of the buyer before making a sale. In addition to confirming the identity of the buyer, sellers also have to take records of sale, with some exceptions, which we will cover. A record of each sale of a Tier 1 or Tier 2 component must be kept for 2 years after the date of the sale. Hard copies of records of sale must be kept locked up when they are not being used. Electronic copies must be password protected. Records of sale must be made available only to people who need to access them in the course of their employment. For Tier 1 and Tier 2 components, the records of sale must include the following: the buyer's name, address, and telephone number, the date of the sale, the bill of lading, sales receipt, or similar document, the type of document provided to establish identification, and the document's reference number, the product name of the component sold, the quantity of the component sold under each product name, an indication of whether the component was sold in bulk or in packages. If the component was sold in packages, the weight or volume of each package, and a description of how the component will be used. When components are shipped, there are some additional requirements. For a Tier 1 component, the driver's license number, the estimated and actual date of delivery, the delivery address, and the quantity received are all required. If the delivery was made at the time of purchase, a receipt signed by the buyer, as well as the required record of sale information. For a Tier 2 component, the date of receipt and the quantity received are both required. It is possible to enter into an annual sales contract with a repeat buyer. In this case, you only have to record the buyer's name, address, telephone number, ID type and number, and description of how the component will be used once a year. Sellers are always required to establish the identity of a buyer prior to making a transaction. However, sellers are not always required to keep records of sale, as this depends on the quantity of restricted components being sold. If the quantity sold is less or equal to the quantity set out in this table, a record of sale is not required. For example, a seller is not required to take a record of sale for the purchase of 1 liter of hydrogen peroxide. However, a record of sale is required for the sale of 1.1 liters of hydrogen peroxide, as it is above the quantity set out in the table. Part 2 of this module provides information on the additional regulatory requirements for sellers of Tier 1 restricted components. If you only sell or store Tier 2 components and do not sell or store any Tier 1 components, you can skip ahead to Module 3. As a component or product seller of Tier 1 restricted components, you must declare in your application to NRCan that you have prepared a security plan for each location where a Tier 1 component will be stored or sold. You must implement the security plan and update it every 12 months. The security plan must include a description of the emergency procedures to be followed in responding to all risk events, the measures to be taken to control access to the component, including control of keys, the measures to be taken to control access to records of sale, the stock management system to be implemented, and the measures to be taken when an employee has reasonable grounds to suspect that the component will be used for a criminal purpose. Product sellers do not need to include a description of the measures to be taken to access records of sale or to refuse a sale, as they are not selling restricted components. More guidance on how to develop your own security plan is available on our website. Component and product sellers of Tier 1 restricted components must also notify their local police force in writing of all locations where a Tier 1 component is to be stored or sold. Due to the nature of the chemical, it is beneficial for local police to be aware of these locations in case there was ever an incident. Any structure that contains a Tier 1 component and every door, window, or other point of access to a building in which the component is stored must be locked when it is not attended. A key control plan must be prepared in writing and implemented. The key control plan should be part of the security plan that we discussed earlier. All main entrances to a building in which a Tier 1 component is stored must be lit at all times outside of business hours. This will help deter and detect any unwanted activity. When a Tier 1 component is received, it is important to verify the integrity of the shipment since chemicals can be vulnerable during transportation. The quantity of the component that is received must be compared with the quantity that is recorded on the bill of lading. Any signs of tampering, attempted theft, or any loss not attributable to normal operations must be recorded, and the record must be kept for 2 years after the date on which it is made. The supplier must also be informed of any of the incidents we just mentioned. When shipping more than 1 kilogram of a Tier 1 component by vehicle, there are requirements that the seller must follow. Each access point on the portions of the vehicle containing the component must be locked or sealed with a security cable immediately after the shipment is loaded. The driver of the vehicle must also be provided with a written notice stating that the component is to be attended unless the vehicle is either parked in a secure location or the vehicle and load are locked up. The driver is to inspect all locks and, if seals are present, inspect all seals at each stop and at the final destination. And the driver must immediately report to the component seller any signs of theft, attempted theft, or tampering, and any loss that is not attributable to normal operations. When any quantity of a Tier 1 component is shipped by rail, each access point on the rail car containing the component must be locked or sealed with a security cable immediately after the shipment is loaded. There must also be a procedure in place to track the shipment on a daily basis until delivery occurs, and to investigate if the shipment does not arrive at its destination. When a Tier 1 component is sold to a buyer who is not a component seller or product seller, the buyer must be provided with a written notice stating that security measures are to be taken to prevent the theft of the component. Any sign of theft, attempted theft, or tampering, and any loss that is not attributable to normal operations must be immediately reported to the local police force, and the resale of the component is prohibited. An annual inventory audit of the component must be performed and submitted to NRCan no later than March 31st of the year following the year of the inventory. The inventory must include the enrollment number of the component or product seller. For each location where the Tier 1 component is stored or sold, a record of the starting inventory, the quantity of the component that was manufactured, the quantity of the component that was acquired, and the manner of acquisition, the quantity of the component that was used, sold, exported, destroyed, stolen, or lost, the year-end inventory, the historical normal range of loss that is due to loss of water or mechanical abrasion, and the contact information of the person who completed the form. Module 3. Reporting obligations for sellers of Tier 1 and Tier 2 restricted components. As a seller of Tier 1 or Tier 2 restricted components, you have the obligation to report any theft, attempted theft, or tampering. You must also refuse a sale if you have reasonable grounds to suspect that the restricted component could be used for criminal purposes. This refusal to sell must also be reported. If any theft, attempted theft, or any tampering with a component is discovered, you must report it. Immediately call your local police department or the RCMP, National Security Information Network. If the incident involves Tier 1 components, you must submit an incident report to the Chief Inspector of Explosives within 24 hours of the discovery. For Tier 2 components, you must contact the Chief Inspector of Explosives within 24 hours after the discovery. You must also submit an incident report to the Chief Inspector of Explosives when circumstances permit. However, if you submit the incident report within 24 hours, this will satisfy the obligation to contact the Chief Inspector. Phone numbers and the process to submit a report will be provided later in this module. A sale must be refused if the component seller has reasonable grounds to suspect that the component will be used for a criminal purpose. If you feel unsure about refusing the sale, you can always ask your manager to help with the transaction. Even if you did let a sale go through and you feel uneasy about it afterwards, you should still report it. The police will decide what to do with the information. However, you can then be assured that you did your due diligence by reporting the incident. Every refusal to sell a restricted component must be reported to your local police or the RCMP National Security Information Network and to the Chief Inspector of Explosives within 24 hours. There are a number of behaviors and signs that could make you suspect that the component will be used for a criminal purpose. There are additional resources to learn more about this, and a training video regarding suspicious transactions. Please visit our website for these resources. It will not be possible to prevent every single purchase for criminal use, but refusing suspicious transactions is a good start. You play a key role in forming the first line of defense against those who would use these explosives precursor chemicals to harm our communities. Please call your local police using the appropriate number for your region. You can also call the RCMP National Security Information Network using the provided number on this slide. Please contact the Chief Inspector of Explosives using the number provided. There are 2 ways to submit the report. If you are enrolled as a component or product seller and have an active account on the Electronic License Management System, you can log in to submit an incident report. If you do not yet have an active account, you can complete Form F07-01 and send it to the Explosives Regulatory Division by email at the coordinates that appear at the bottom of the form. Please visit our website at erd.nrcan.gc.ca to access the Electronic License Management System and Form F07-01. Module 4. Summary. Let's quickly summarize what was discussed in this training. There are 14 chemicals regulated as restricted components under the explosives regulations. The 3 categories of restricted components are Tier 1, 2, and 3. Tier 1 has the most requirements. You must enroll with NRCan if you are a component or product seller of a Tier 1 or Tier 2 component. As a seller, you are required to 1. Lock up your components. 2. Control access to the chemicals. 3. Check IDs before making a sale. 4. Keep records of sale. And 5. Report incidents. You must also refuse a sale if you have reasonable grounds to suspect the component will be used for a criminal purpose. It is important to report incidents. We hope that this training helped you better understand your regulatory responsibilities regarding the access, inventory, and sale of restricted components, and your obligations to report incidents and refusals to sell. Visit erd.nrcan.gc.ca for more information and resources, including guidelines, a chemical security awareness video, and the Explosives Act and regulations. Please reach out if you have any questions or need clarification about anything covered in this training. Thank you for taking the time to watch this training. You are taking important steps to ensure our communities remain safe. Canada is counting on your eyes, your instincts, and your cooperation. Sell chemicals responsibly.